Alright, what we have here is a 2001 Excursion 7.3 liter in it. It has what I suspect to be a bad oil cooler. Puked out all the coolant, and it is just nasty. The oil cooler was done a few weeks before this happened, apparently, but either one of the seals is bad or a gasket went in wrong or something. Start getting it cleaned out here and pull the oil cooler off, see if we can figure out what happened to it. Okay, so I had pulled the block heater element out and the block drain on the right side. Got to pull the starter to get to that one, but let it sit and drain overnight. It's pretty nasty in here. Look at the thickness of the sludge inside the upper radiator hose. It's really bad. This one's severe. It's going to take a whole lot of flushing to get all this out, and it's going to take a lot of time. As the stuff was draining out, the sludge is so thick it was just stacking up like soft serve ice cream. It's pretty disgusting. So pulled the upper radiator hose, and this is what the thermostat looks like. Just covered in that nasty peanut butter stuff. Judging by the look of the upper radiator hose, I'm thinking probably at least 4 flushes on this. This is really bad. Come on, focus. Yeah, it's pretty miserable. You can also see on removal of the water pump, there's all sorts of sludge in there too, but more interestingly is whoever installed the water pump used RTV. Completely unnecessary on this truck. Those gaskets seal well, just as long as you torque everything right. 18 foot-pounds, I believe, is a spec on it. Alright, got the oil cooler out, and looking at the gaskets, this is a rear gasket. You can see that it's torn. There's a chunk missing right here. I think this is our problem. This gasket obviously is not an OEM gasket. If you look real close at the way it's made, all these little mold retention thingies here are pointed. On the OEM one, they're consistently round all the way up in there, which leads me to believe the oil cooler itself is not OEM. Probably going to replace that with an OEM one as well. As soon as I started loosening the oil cooler, I knew that there was probably a problem with that itself. You could tell the torque on the bolts was completely uneven. One was torqued down like a gorilla hung on the thing, and one was barely torqued down at all. So that's an important thing with these gaskets. You want them to torque down well, because that way they seal, and if they don't seal, you end up with this. Also found on the front mount that whoever installed it used some sort of gasket cement or adhesive, and that really isn't a good idea on these. I've had it bite me before. I tried it, and it caused the gasket to leak externally, not internally, fortunately, but it did still cause a leak. Just to illustrate how poorly this sludge flows, this oil cooler's been hanging here vertical now for about 30 minutes. And that sludge is, geez, barely a quarter-inch down in those tubes. So that's what makes this so bad to get out of here, is this stuff just doesn't want to move. And there's the smoking gun. Yep. Dorman. Junk. I won't use anything Dorman that takes more than about 30 seconds of disassembly to change. And I certainly won't use their products on anything critical like this. This is the OEM gasket. Around every seal, you can see the casting. That's how a gasket's supposed to align. If the sealing surface hangs into the port, it's going to get cut off when it gets tightened down, and it's going to leak. Alright, let's do a little comparison between the aftermarket Dorman piece of junk and an OEM cooler. There's some pretty obvious differences. On the Dorman, the quality of the machining is not real good. If you run your fingernail along it, it's like a file. The Ford one, or Navistar, it's machined much better. An O-ring on there, if there's pressure changes and the O-ring shifts back and forth on that, the Dorman one's going to erode the O-ring and it's going to leak. Every OEM cooler I've ever seen has that little diamond in there, the Navistar diamond. just stamped lightly in the fins. It's got to be an identifier. The other thing that's glaringly obvious is the density of the cooling fins. There are far more fins in the OEM than in the Dorman. The OEM cooler is going to be a lot more efficient at transferring heat. It's going to keep the oil cooler. Overall, the OEM is definitely the way to go. The coolant tubes on the Dorman, the ends of all of them have a flare on them. It makes me kind of think that these are not furnace brazed in. Whereas the OEM, they're all smooth. And I'm pretty sure those tubes are furnace brazed to this plate for sealing. I kind of think the Dorman may just rely on that copper tube being flared out enough into the holes in the end plate. That's probably not a good thing. Let me see if I can get the O-rings on here one-handed. Just going to set it on. The green one goes on first. Just going to work it right over that first ridge. Slide it down right to the second. Black one sits there. That's all there is to that. I'm going to lube those up with some good high quality assembly lube. The stuff is slicker than snot, and get an end cap on. I don't always paint oil coolers, but when I do, I paint them with whatever's closest to the front of the shelf. Anyhow, I wasn't able to get video of putting the mounts back on it. I needed both hands for that, but I'll show you. I'll show you a way that it's usually pretty easy to do it. This one I was able to just put it on a block of wood and put some weight on it, and they slid right on. But that doesn't always happen. If you're having trouble getting the ends on, if you throw a ratchet strap, or if you don't have a ratchet strap, a piece of rope will work on it, and just get it fairly snug. Doesn't have to be tight. If you start ratcheting it, it's going to pull the mounts around, and they're going to not want to go on. But if you just get it snug and grab both sides of the ratchet strap and pull out, should pull the ends right on. It hasn't failed for me, so give it a shot. While you have a cooler apart, check up inside the end, inside the mounts where the O-ring seat. Make sure it's not pitted. The front mount's usually pretty good. The rear mount is usually the one that gets pitted out inside, because that's the one that catches everything off the road, any road salt or whatever the garbage they're using is now, but it's very corrosive. You can tell where the O-rings sit. There's a little step. The O-ring goes pretty much up against the step inside the mount. The end one goes almost all the way in the end, but usually you can tell by looking where they actually go. If it's corroded, clean it up, look at it, make sure the pitting isn't too deep. You may have to replace them out, especially if you're in a salt environment. Okay, I got the block heater element cleaned up to put it back in the rear oil cooler mount where it goes, and just wanted to check it, see if it was any good. So using Ohm's law, we know it's a 1 kilowatt heater element at 120 volts. So when you do all the math, it comes out to, it should be 14 ohms resistance. And it's pretty close, so that's a good heater element. This is where the rear oil cooler mount on the engine goes. Just wanted to show you where the serial number will be on these engines. Sometimes you'll get asked for the serial number. It's behind the oil cooler mount. The earlier ones had it stamped in with nice punches. The later ones, it was pin engraved, and it can be pretty hard to read. You might have to get a camera up in there and take a picture of it with a bright light and zoom in and all sorts of stuff to see it. Anyhow, back here is where the rear block drain is. It's behind the oil cooler mount. It'll be between the mounting surface and the back of the engine here, where the bell housing bolts up to it. This is the right side, passenger side. This is the block drain here to the water jacket. It is, you'll have to pull the starter to get to it. All right, I threaded the oil cooler back up in. We're looking at the front mounting area again now. I could not video putting it in there. If I don't video something, generally it's because it takes both hands to do it. But anyhow, I've got the upper bolt through the hole on the front mount. I've got the gasket hung on it. I'll get the upper one started. I'll get it up in close to there and align the gasket and get the lower one started. Then I'll go ahead and tighten everything up. The rear bolts, I got 2 in and left them just with a couple threads caught so I could have some room to work with the front. Okay, the oil cooler's in and torqued down. Next step's a water pump. New gasket in it. Cleaned out all the RTV from the groove. Just make sure the gasket is in and seated evenly. And you can hang the water pump on and torque the bolts down and you should be good to go. I don't think I've ever had one of these leak just using the gasket. Water pump has 3 different length bolts. There are 3 very long ones. There's one semi-long one and the rest of them are short. The 3 longest go here, here, and here. And then the middle-sized one goes over here. And the rest of them get the short ones. We're going to go ahead and install the thermostat now. And for those, I prefer, you guessed it, Motorcraft. One of the features on the Motorcraft is the way the gasket is. It is molded around the whole edge, and they just don't leak. All the aftermarkets come with an O-ring that sits on top of just the metal flange of the thermostat, and they do tend to leak. For installation, the little vent right there toward the bottom doesn't really need to go in any specific direction, but I usually put it toward the back of the engine, and there's an arrow on the other side that I point to the front, just for consistency and to satisfy my OCD. Okay, this excursion is all back together, and I've added about 3 gallons of water back to the cooling system. I'm going to go ahead and put in about 1/3 of a bottle of dishwashing detergent. That's about right. And then just going to drive it, get it up to temperature, drain it, flush it, fill it, and repeat that process until the water comes out clear. And then we'll drain it one last time and run it with some fresh water for a while, then drain that and fill it up with the proper mix of coolant. And that should be the end of this story. If it's not, you'll see more video. So you're probably thinking this is a bad sign, and you'd be right. The road test / first flush didn't go so well. It blew out a lot of steam, white smoke, whatever you want to call it. So I'm checking for combustion gas in the cooling system to kind of rule out a head gasket problem. And so far, no change in the color indicates a negative test. And it's not going to change at this point. It's just going to stay blue. If there was combustion gas in there, the fluid would turn green. We'll give it a few more squeezes just to be safe. Yep, still blue. So when I get a negative combustion gas test in the cooling system, I just verify that the fluid's working by sucking up some exhaust through it. And you can see it almost immediately color change to green, and that would indicate combustion gases in the cooling system had it done that up there.